Hi, how are you? SS2 students, how you doing? Okay, I trust you all are doing fine. Welcome to our class. Okay, this time we're talking about pollination in flowering plants. The last time we talked about reproductive system in flowering plants. Okay, so now we're going to talk about pollination, which occurs in flowering plants. So to begin with, as required, okay, it's very necessary you know the objectives, and we'll be calling out the objectives one after the other, and we'll be doing justice to each of them. So first of all is that you know the definition, or by the end of this lesson you'll be able to define the term pollination. So what do we mean by pollination? Before we delve in, I gave you notes already on this topic, and I trust you've downloaded the notes, okay, because this is basically going to be discussion of the notes. Okay, so pollination. What is pollination? I know you've heard about it before. This is not the first time you have come across the word. So you have an idea, I suppose. However, for formality, we'll just discuss and we'll define. So what do we mean by pollination? Now, pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. That's just simple, right? It's just the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. And then another objective is that you know the types of pollination. So pollination, like we said, occurs in flowering plants, because it's only in flowering plants that you have these parts, these floral parts of anther, stigma, okay. So what are the two types of pollination? We have cross-pollination and self-pollination. So the two types will be self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now that you know the types, what do they mean? How will you be able to define each of them? That's another objective, that you should be able to define the types of pollination in flowering plants. So when we talk about self-pollination, we mean the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of that same flower. Or it can also be defined to be the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower, but of the same plant. You know, in a flowering plant, we can have many flowers. So in as much as the transfer is within that plant, in as much as the transfer and the reception is within that same one plant, that same plant, okay, then it is still self-pollination. So you've seen that self-pollination could be in terms of flower, in terms of the same flower, or in terms of different flowers but of the same flowering plant. Okay. Now, in contrast, cross-pollination will be the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower in another plant. So it is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower of one plant to the stigma of a flower of another plant. So two plants are involved. However, these two flowering plants which are involved are of the same species. They are of the same kind. In other words, it should be the transfer of pollen grains from a hibiscus flowering plant, okay, pollen grains, okay, from a hibiscus to the stigma of a hibiscus flowering plant, another hibiscus flowering plant, okay. So it cannot be transferred from hibiscus flowering plant to, say, Belonyx, or hibiscus flowering plant to, say, rose, or hibiscus flowering plant to, say, maize flowering plant. No. The flowering plants, for cross-pollination to take place, must be of the same plant species, of the same kind. So from hibiscus flowering plant to another hibiscus flowering plant. Okay? From Pride of Barbados flowering plant to another Pride of Barbados flowering plant. So when we talk about cross-pollination, it is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower of a given plant to the stigma of a flower of another flowering plant, both of the same plant species. Okay, so the two flowering plants involved in cross-pollination must be of the same species. Now, it is very important to know that mature pollen grains should be transferred to mature stigma. Okay, so mature pollen grains, which will be coming from a mature anther, will be transferred to a mature stigma. So they both, whether the male organs, the female organs, must be mature for pollination to take place. I hope that is clear. Okay, having said that, we can now define pollination again to be the transfer of mature pollen grains from the anther to the mature stigma of a flower. The transfer of mature pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the mature stigma of a flower. So it's very important to know that maturity is important for pollination and for fertilization to occur, because fertilization will be the resultant of pollination. So there can't be fertilization if there is no pollination. Okay? And of course, it's only mature gametes that can fertilize to give rise to seeds, fruits, and a new flowering plant. Okay, so having said that, it is very important that we moved on to the next objective of this class, which is that you know the agents of pollination. So the agents of pollination will be insects, wind, water, even animals like birds, bats, including man. Okay? But the two major, the two most common agents will be insects and wind. Okay? So we want to look at the differences between an insect pollinated flower and a wind pollinated flower. Let's see a difference or the differences that exist between an insect pollinated flower and a wind pollinated flower. So if you will get two flowers in which one of them is pollinated by insects and another is by wind, okay, there will be certain differences you will notice between them because they have been naturally modified to be well adapted to the kind of pollination that will occur in them. So one thing you will notice in an insect pollinated flower is that the petals are colorful. They come in different colors to attract the insects because the insects are well attracted, such as butterflies, okay? They are well attracted to colors, especially beautiful ones that are really deep, such as red, pink, yellow, purple, okay, violet, okay, beautiful colors, maroon, okay. You can think of beautiful. I know you've seen many beautifully colored petals, okay, even white, okay. They can also be attracted to white, okay. Some of them may just be normal green, okay. However, their colors are very attractive to these insects, which will, okay, insects find them attractive, the colors, okay. And so you notice that insect pollinated flowers, they have beautifully colored petals. Unlike the wind pollinated flower, you will notice that when you compared that insect pollinated flower with the wind pollinated flower, you notice that the wind pollinated flower is not as colorful. Even if it comes in colors, it may be just dull, not that deep, not at all, okay. And then another one is you discover that the insect pollinated flower, okay, if you compared it to the wind pollinated flower, the insect pollinated flower, okay, will have enlarged and conspicuous petals in terms that the petals are wide, like large in size, okay, very conspicuous. You can really see it, you can obviously see it, very large enough to be seen. But if it was wind pollinated flower, you discover that it's not as conspicuous, the petals, okay, it can be just small leaf, okay, the petals can be small, not broad. Then another thing you discover with the insect pollinated flower is that it has scent, okay. You can easily, and this scent or perfume, okay, natural perfumery is what can attract the insect, because the insect will know that there is a tendency for nectars, that's the juice, for it to consume as food. But for the wind pollinated flower, you discover that no scent, no perfumery smell, okay. Then another thing you discover with the insect pollinated flower is that there is the presence of nectar, okay, which produces nectar, which is the juice that the insect will consume as food when it perches on the flower. But for wind pollinated flower, you discover that there is no nectar that produces nectar. That's another difference. The other thing you discover with the insect pollinated flower is that the pollen grains are sticky. But for the wind pollinated flower, the pollen grains are not sticky. Now, why are the pollen grains sticky in insect pollinated flowers? So that they can easily stick to the bodies of the insects, okay, that will perch on them to feed on nectars. And in the process, they can easily transfer, okay, when they when these pollen grains are stuck to the, say, the hairs, the legs, okay, of this insect, the wings of this insect, they can easily carry them and deposit them on the stigma in the course of perching on the petals and even feeding from the nectary. But for the wind pollinated flowers, the pollen grains are not stuck, they are not sticky. Then another difference you discover with the insect pollinated flower is that the filament, okay, which bears the anther, okay, it's not that long, okay, it's not long, okay, it can be short and can be covered by the petals. So the filaments are not long, so there is a tendency that the petals can cover them. So, and there is, because of this, okay, there will be proximity or nearness or closeness between these petals and the filaments bearing the anthers, okay, such that when the insect is perching on the petal, in the course of feeding, okay, it can have contact with the anther, which produces the pollen grains, so that the pollen grains can attach to the body of the insect, and the insect can be able to fly and convey it to the stigma of that flower, even in the course of feeding or perching. So that's how nature has made it, so that's why it's possible for insect pollination, because nature has made it in such a way that the filaments are not so long. So when the insect is feeding, it can brush its body against the anther, which has pollen grains, and these pollen grains will then attach to the body of the insect, and the insect can carry them and deposit on the stigma of that same flower or even another flower, okay, of that same plant, or even to a different flower entirely of a different plant but of the same plant species. So insect pollination can be in terms of self or cross. The insects can aid in self-pollination and even cross-pollination, as the case may be. Then in wind-pollinated flowers, you discover that the filaments are longer. Okay, you know that the filament is the long tube that bears the anther. So it's longer and it shoots up above the petals, okay, outside of the flower. Okay, it's well positioned above the rest part of the flowers, okay, and this will make, so you see that filament is long, and this will make that wind can easily, okay, carry the pollen grains, blow them to the stigma of the same flower of the same plant, or even a different flower of a different plant but of the same plant species. So even wind pollination can aid with self-pollination and wind pollination, as the case may be. Okay. So those are some of the differences, okay, that will exist between the insect pollinated flower and the wind pollinated flower. Now, one thing I think is correct is that, of course, during this transference, the distance should not be too far, even if it's cross-pollination, okay? It should be such that the insect can fly to with ease, okay? So it should not be too far, and it should not also be too far, because if it's too far, in the course of the insect flying, it may lose the pollen grains. So I think that the plants, even in cross-pollination, the different plants should be kind of close, but may not be too close, but at least let them be at least near enough for the insect to make this transference. And even the wind, okay, it should be that the wind is blowing the same direction, okay, so there should be closeness of these different plants for cross-pollination to be able to take place, okay, because if it's too wide, it may really hamper the smooth process of cross-pollination, okay? So even if the two plants are a meter away, okay, even if they are just a meter away, it's still cross-pollination, because the plants may be apart by a meter, okay. No matter how apart they are, so far they are different plants, then it's still cross-pollination. All right, so I think that is clear enough. Okay, now the next thing we'll be talking about, or the next objective we'll be talking about, is the conditions or devices. Okay, we'll be looking at the conditions or the devices that aid self-pollination. Okay, and the conditions and devices that aid cross-pollination. So we'll be looking at the conditions and devices that aid self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now, what we mean by these conditions or devices are, what are the mechanisms, or as in what are those conditions, so to say, okay, what are those make-up that will help the smooth running of this, that will aid self-pollination or that will aid cross-pollination. Okay, what are the adaptive measures, what are the make-up, the natural make-up or helps, okay, that will aid the smooth, okay, running, so to say, of cross-pollination and self-pollination. So when we talk about conditions or devices, okay, those adaptive measures that flowers have that will help them in self-pollination or cross-pollination. Okay, let's consider self-pollination. What are the conditions? What are the devices? What are the mechanisms, adaptive mechanisms, okay, that foster or that will aid the occurrence of self-pollination, okay? It could be physiological or behavioral by the plants themselves. It can also be environmental, okay? But anyhow it comes, it is such that they will promote self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now, we'll talk about conditions for self-pollination. Okay, we'll be looking at, there are two major conditions that will aid self-pollination to take place. That if these conditions are not met, then there will be no self-pollination. And these are homogamy and cleistogamy. So homogamy and cleistogamy are the two conditions that must be met for self-pollination to take place in flowering plants or in flowers. Now, what do we mean by homogamy? Now, when we talk about homogamy as related to self-pollination, okay, it has to do with the fact that the stigma and the anther of the same flower are ripening at the same time. It has to do with the fact that the anther and the stigma of different flowers of the same plant are ripening at the same time. So this will now aid self-pollination. It means that there will be pollination within the flower or pollination within the flowering plant. Of course, if the anther will mature at the same time as the stigma, then the anther will be able to produce mature pollen grains, which the stigma will receive and will be sent to the ovules, which are mature via the pollen tubes formed within the filament or the style rather. Okay, the pollen tube will be formed within the style. Okay, so the pollen grain that has been deposited on the stigma will travel down the pollen tube formed along the style, okay, into the ovules, and before you know it, seeds, fruits, and a new flowering plant can be formed. So if they both mature, if the male and female organs both mature at the same time, then they will be receptive, okay? The stigma will be receptive, and reproduction, sexual reproduction can set in for a new life of that species. So there will be perpetuation of life because they are maturing at the same time. So that will aid self-pollination. And it's very important that you note that in homogamy, we're talking about hermaphroditic flowering plants because they both have the male and female part. Or we can also look at it, we can also call it bisexual flowering plants or bisexual flowers because they are having both male and female part. Or we can also look at it from the term called what? Monoecious, because having both male and female part. Okay, so that's that. So that would certainly aid, okay, because no one will say, I'm not ready yet, I'm still not mature, so you better give it to another, do a cross-pollination to another flower, okay? So there will be no argument about that. So once one is ready, the other one is ready, of course, together they fuse up and give off a new life, okay? So that is homogamy. Now we'll talk about, so that you've seen that it can aid self-pollination, right? Okay. So now we'll talk about cleistogamy. What do we mean by cleistogamy? Now in cleistogamy, there will be the anther, okay, will mature, producing mature pollen grains, okay? However, the stigma of that flower is not yet mature, but when the pollen grains of that anther, of that flower, okay, is transferred to the stigma of that same flower, okay, you will discover that that will induce or make the stigma to ripen. Okay, that will make the stigma to ripen, and it's already ripe, so the ovules are ripe and fertilization can take place. Sexual reproduction can occur. So the transference of the mature pollen grains to the stigma will induce or make the immature stigma to now become mature. Okay, so this contact of the mature pollen grains onto the immature stigma will make the latter, or the stigma, to become mature. Okay, and then of course sexual reproduction can set in. You see that? So these are the two conditions that must be met for sexual reproduction, self-pollination to take place. Okay, either of the two must be met. Okay, at least one of them, okay, must be met for self-pollination to set in place or to be promoted. So that's that for self-pollination. Now, somebody may ask, what about cross-pollination? Are there conditions or devices that can also aid cross-pollination? What are those devices or mechanisms or conditions or natural or behavioral tendencies of the flowering plants that will make that only cross-pollination can occur in this certain kind of flower? That no self-pollination can just occur in this kind of flower, only cross-pollination. So what are those equipment they naturally are equipped with, okay, that will help them undergo cross-pollination? So that will be the next one we'll be looking at, and we'll be discussing 3 major conditions. Okay? We'll be discussing 3 major conditions of the cross-pollination. So the first one we're talking about is dichogamy. Then we'll be talking about self-sterility, and we'll be talking about unisexuality. Okay, so when we talk about dichogamy, it's just the process whereby one reproductive organ of the flower, one sex organ of flower ripens while the other sex organ of that bisexual flower is not ripened. So it could be that it is the male sex organs that ripened while the female sex organs of that same flower is not ripe. Or it could be that the female ones are ripe but the male sexual organs are not ripe. So it's just one of the sex organs, being ripe while the other sex reproductive structure is not ripe yet. So in this case, we'll be seeing or taking a look at dichogamy in two major groups or classes. So dichogamy can be classed into two, which is protandry and protogyny. So protandry and protogyny. Did I get it? Right. So protandry and protogyny. So what we mean, if we dissect the word protogyny, we'll have proto and gyne. Now proto is like first, then gyne is the female sex organs. So that means that the female sex organs will mature first. Now when we talk about protandry, it's like first. Now when we talk about andry, that's like from the word androecium. So that is the male flowering sex organs, isn't it? Remember androecium or androecium, anyone you want to call it, but I think androecium. So when we talk about androecium, we're talking about the male sex structures, isn't it, of flowers. Then when we talk about gynoecium, we're talking about the female sex organs. So that's why we have protoandroecium, that is protoandry, and then protogynoecium or protogyny. All right. So very, very important you know these terms. So protoandry, it means that the andry, that's the male part, will mature first, and then we'll talk about protogyny. It means that the gynoecium must mature first. So protandry, what else? Protogyny. So very important you know them. Now we'll talk about protogyny. It means that the female part will mature first before the male part. So in protogyny, you see that the stigma is already mature in the flower, but the anther is not mature yet. So the female sex organs are mature, ready to reproduce sexually, but the male partner is not ready for reproduction. Come on. Of course, the female part can't wait. She needs to get fertilized. She needs to reproduce. So she just can't wait. So she thinks of cross-pollination, isn't it? So since my male partner in my house is not ready, maybe I just have to go out there and meet another guy who is ready for me, something like that. So that is why it is, so that's how cross-pollination comes in, because the partner in the house is not ready. So she has to look outside. So she'll be waiting for, let's put it that way, she in quotes, we'll be waiting for, pollen grains from mature anther, okay, it will be waiting for mature pollen grains from another anther of another flower of another plant. Okay, so if she's lucky that another flowering plant has a mature pollen grain or mature pollen grains, then they can be crossed fertilization. Okay, so they can be cross fertilized, or cross fertilization can take place, or cross pollination rather can take place now. Okay, so it means that the pollen grains will be coming from another flower of another plant. Okay, but of course of the same plant species, and that's how she can get fertilized, and sexual reproduction can take place, and new fruit seeds and even flowering plants can emerge from that fusion of the pollen grains with the ovules in the ovary. Okay, so that's that. But when we talk about protandry, the reverse is the case, because the male sex organs are ready, but the female sex organs are not ready. So the male gets offended or annoyed and would think of another option, going cross. So maybe sending its pollen grains to another flowering plant, which may be having, okay, mature stigma, so that fertilization can take place, so that there can be sexual reproduction. Okay, of course these plants should be of the same plant species, and the agents, of course, we've discussed, can be what? Insects, can be wind, depending. All right, okay. So that's what we mean by that. Now, when we talk about unisexuality, of course, unisexuality will just lead to cross-pollination, because in unisexuality, we are looking at the fact that only one sex reproductive structure is available in that plant. For example, if you get a flower and you find only the androecium present, then it's terminate. If you find if you get a flower and it's only the pistil or gynoecium present, then it's pistillate, right? So if you find only the staminate, of course the staminate will also need to sexually reproduce, but it's not having a pistillate part. So what will happen? It must send its pollen grains, mature pollen grains, to another flower of another plant. So cross-pollination will certainly take place when there is unisexuality, because that's just the option, okay, and vice versa, you understand? So when we talk about self-sterility, this is the tendency that, okay, self-sterility as pertains to cross-pollination is that the female parts, okay, mostly the female parts will make themselves sterile, in the sense that they will not accept self-pollination. That is, even of that bisexual flowering plant, okay, the stigma will refuse, okay, to be fertilized, also to say, like, it will refuse mature pollen grains of its flower from coming in contact with it. So the stigma will repel, okay, will become repulsive. Like it doesn't like, okay, to be attached. Okay, it doesn't like the pollen grains of its flower to attach to it, so to say. Okay, so it makes itself sterile. In other words, it cannot be able to sexually reproduce with the pollen grains coming from its own flower or of the same plant, but it would rather accept, okay, for pollination. It would rather accept for pollination, okay, it would rather accept for pollination only pollen grains, mature pollen grains coming from another flowering plant, but of the same species. Do you understand it? So if the pollen grains are coming from the same flower or the same plant, the stigma of that flower of that plant will refuse to be pollinated. Will refuse that its pollen grains will attach to it. So it will make itself self-sterile. That is, it will like become non-reproductive, okay? It will like become non-sexual or asexual, or it cannot carry out reproductive functions with its own kind, with its own pollen grains. But when the pollen grains are coming from another flowering plant, but of the same species, okay, it gets attracted, okay, it accepts for pollination, okay, and then pollen tube can be formed within the style down to the ovules for fertilization to take place with the pollen grains. You see now? So that's what we mean by self-sterility. Most times it is the stigma that makes itself sterile, okay? When the pollen grains are coming from its own flower, its own plant, like I've said, all right? So having discussed that, let's quickly look at the last objective, which is that some examples of flowers that can be pollinated by insects. Some of them will include your roses, pride of Barbados, your flamboyant, your what else? Hibiscus flowers. All these flowers you find with colorful petals. Okay. Then examples of those that are not pollinated or that can be pollinated by wind is those ones that are less colorful, like we said, like your millet, your grain flowers. You see them, right? And your guinea grass flowers, you see. So those are some of the examples. Okay, so let's just stop here for today, and I hope the lesson is very clear, all right? And I would trust and I would like you to actually read the notes, okay? Look into your textbooks, make more research, and listen to the videos. I'm sure with these you'll be able to get better understanding. All right. Thanks for being there, and some other time. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed the class. Okay. Bye. Thank you.